to another episode of the Modern Cyber Podcast. I am your host, Jeremy, and I am delighted to be joined today by somebody who's been in the industry longer than I have and has probably a broader and deeper range of experience specifically to cybersecurity, so I know I'm going to learn a lot from today's conversation. I'm joined today by Steve Orrin. Steve Orrin is Intel's federal CTO and a senior principal engineer. He leads public sector solution architecture, strategy, and technology engagement. He's held technology leadership positions at Intel, where leading cybersecurity programs, custom hardware, software architecture, solutions, products, and strategy. Wow, that's a mouthful. And you've seen a lot, Steve. And Steve is a cybersecurity expert and sought-after advisor to public and private sector leaders on enterprise security, risk mitigation, and securing complex systems. Steve's also a leading authority on public sector and federal mission and enterprise systems and solutions, regularly engaging with the United States government senior technical and mission leadership. He's the Intel representative on security standards and guidance and has contributed to several NIST standards and guidance publications. Steve's a supply chain threat and risk management advisor to DoD and intelligence community senior leadership and was chosen by the U.S. government to serve as a special government employee on the congressionally mandated task force to perform an assessment of microelectronics quantifiable assurance, MQA, and microelectronics security. Steve, I don't know where you find the time to do all of that other than across, I guess, a long and illustrious career, but that is a real depth and breadth of experience that I'm kind of envious of. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us today.
Thank you, Jeremy. It's a pleasure to be here today.
Awesome. Well, across all of that experience, there's something that's been on my mind recently that I'd be curious to get your take on. And that is, you've seen a lot of different domain spaces across those areas. And I feel like in cybersecurity, we're at a point where we're starting to realize that gathering data from different domain spaces is super valuable and can help us cut through the noise. And yet I see customers really struggling to cut through noise again and again. They're just kind of collecting data and maybe not really getting into the depth or the value of correlation. Is this something that you're seeing as well?
So, Jeremy, you hit on a very interesting point there. There is a lot of data that's being collected across all those domains when it comes to cyber events, cyber protection, and risk management. And there are multiple challenges that are presented to organizations as they try to sift through it and actually make heads or tails of what they're seeing and what's going on within their enterprise and within their systems. Some of those challenges revolve around siloed or domain-specific data that isn't really easily correlated with other data, very context specific, or on the other side, you get data that's divorced of the context, especially things that are coming from the perimeter or from sort of your network infrastructure, often lacks the understanding and context of, well, what's the end result? What did that message come to? What had happened on the host? And just correlating between the outside and the inside becomes a unique challenge. Throw into that mix the diversity of the information coming from different vendors, different architectures, different protocols and log schemes. Now you're dealing with information on multiple different schemas and multiple different formats and trying to piece this all together at the same time as the volume and the sheer volume of that data. And so one of the challenges is how do you start connecting the dots between these different domains and sifting together and really trying to make an informed decision around what are you seeing, what is happening, using data as driving those, your decisions and your risk management. The other, and this is a less talked about issue, is that most of the feeds that organizations are looking at today, for very good reasons, are their cyber data. Your firewalls, your XDR, your EDR, your AV, all of these tools are providing data within their domain about the things that they recognize. And so, everyone's talking about, I've got this kind of effect. I'm seeing this signature that I've seen elsewhere. And so they're presenting you very domain specific data. But when you think about an attack or a campaign against an organization, it's not a single hit. It's a whole campaign. Right. It's a life cycle of multiple things that lead to a goal. The adversaries are going to use a bunch of tricks in their arsenal. They're going to do some reconnaissance. They're going to try to get through some vulnerabilities, and they're going to land someplace and do their lateral. They have all these steps in the kill chain. And what we have today in organizations is a bunch of sensors and tools that are picking different pieces of that life cycle, different pieces of that flow, and trying to present their view on what happened in their specific area with none of the ongoing, temporal context of what actually happened. How did they get in? What did they do? How long were they there? And so it falls back onto the organization trying to figure out and pull together these strings of a temporal view of the time from moment of attack all the way through to the negative outcome, and sift that together. And that presents a unique challenge because no tool is seeing everything. They're seeing their piece, and then it's the organization's job to try to fill in the blanks. One area of signal that I think is interesting that folks are starting to look at a different area outside of the security domain to get better visibility into the context or to what actually happened on a given system. And that is looking at things like performance and operational data from the systems and infrastructures themselves. At the end of the day, malware has to run on the platform.
On something.
It's using CPU cycles. It's leveraging the network I/O and memory. It's transversing across the network infrastructure. So an untapped area of exploration is those infrastructure and platforms themselves, and what are they reporting, and what can you glean from what really happened there. And I think one of the interesting challenges for the industry going forward is how do you marry those two worlds, the cyber side of the events and the practical what went on information from the platforms, your cloud infrastructure, your network infrastructure, what they're telling you, that both are being monitored, but by very different people.
Yeah, this is such a great point. I wrote a piece not too long ago. You can find it on our blog. I'm no expert in the domain of endpoint stuff, EDR, endpoint detection and response. That's like pretty well outside my area of expertise. But I had been somewhat pessimistic about the EDR space in the sense that, where I come from, I've been working with very cloud native companies for the last 6-7 years. And I've been seeing a shift away from using kind of server-based architectures, right? So away from your classic virtual machines and more into containerized environments and serverless function platforms and things like that. And I started to see a little bit of a decline in the adoption of EDR across those environments. Why? Because, they're super ephemeral. They might only live for a day or two. You spin up a container for 8 hours and then it goes away. And the overhead of, let's say, installing an EDR agent and the management that goes into it may not be worth it from some, from the vantage point of some. But your point about looking at, let's say, performance data is something that I've looked at as kind of another thing. At the end of the day, and I threw this out there to a friend of mine who works deeply in the EDR space, I was like, I think what CrowdStrike and Datadog see is probably 75 to 80% the same data. And, one is very much an EDR company and one is very much an application performance monitoring company. But yet, exactly to your point, they've got to use a CPU. They've got to use disk. They've got to run in memory. They have to probably use some user account on the host system to load, to execute, for permissions to different files and so on. And so that's a really interesting point about collecting data from other locations.
It is. And I'll pick on the example you gave in the EDR. What we're starting to see are the EDR vendors tapping into that resource, if you will, of the platform performance. I'll pick on CrowdStrike because you mentioned them. They actually have visibility now into the CPU performance information and the primitives on every platform that's reporting the CPU utilization, the how an application is performing, and what are the I/O and registers that are being leveraged.
Yeah.
And they're using that along with their behavioral analysis and tools that Intel and others have developed to identify the aberrant behavior that ransomware or APTs perform. Because while they can be stealthy and persistent, there are two things to recognize. They still have to run on the CPU and leverage memory and I/O, so they're still going to hit the system in that perspective. And additionally, the operations of a ransomware attack are fundamentally different from your word processing or browsing. And so even though they try to obfuscate, at the end of the day, they're doing different functions, and those functions from a CPU's perspective are different enough to identify as aberrant behavior from the normal behavior you typically see on any given system. And so by marrying those two worlds together of sort of the cyber event side, which like a CrowdStrike and SentinelOne and others use, with those low-level performance indicators, they're actually able to get a much quicker determination that something anomalous is happening and be able to identify what they're seeing along with what's actually happening and tie those together much quicker than waiting for all the after effect or mapping a signature to some other event. And so we're seeing that being taken advantage of by some of the leading edge EDR vendors, as well as other cloud infrastructure and some of the security services providers are looking at
Yeah.
the instrumentation they get from the cloud. Like you said, a container is ephemeral, but for that moment in time, it was there. No matter how much you want to use the word serverless, there's still a server running.
Sure. Yeah.
And for that moment in time, when you have that container, it's operating on a physical environment. And so having the ability to collect the data or to analyze the data of what was going on at that moment and be able to match that to a negative effect or anomalous behaviors later gives you a much more powerful way of viewing that information. As I said at the beginning, it gives you context. And that I've been doing cybersecurity for many years now. And one of the biggest challenges in every security product is how do I map what I'm seeing to context? How is it context specific? Oftentimes this is how you deal with false positives and false negatives, is that without context, all you have is a signal. And so going back to your point earlier of how do we correlate, I think one of the things that organizations need to be thinking about is not just how do I cross correlate amongst security products, which we need to do, but also how do I give those security products better visibility into the infrastructure and platforms so they can get better context into what they're seeing. And that marriage, I think, was going to help all of us be much more successful.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've seen this, I spent some time with one of the largest vulnerability management companies around, and there was always a challenge with vulnerability management that, pretty much as soon as you turn it on, your laundry list of vulnerabilities in your environment is one that can basically, a human can't really comprehend, and B, without automation, it's effectively impossible to remediate all the vulnerabilities that you might have in an environment. But one of the questions that came up very often is like, which of these vulnerabilities do I actually need to worry about? And so that point about context, it's like, well, okay, a vulnerability as such is just a vulnerability. But a vulnerability on, let's say, a public-facing system that has direct internet exposure, well, that context obviously raises the prioritization of that vulnerability. And if you can then correlate it one step further to an active campaign from a ransomware gang or a nation state or whatever, people are out there hitting Log4j seriously right now. Well, okay, of course you prioritize Log4j. So that level of contextualization, I think, is super, super critical. I'm curious about one other aspect of it, right? So we've talked about, let's say, the technical side and let's say data sources, whether it's security tools, performance monitoring tools, what have you. But what about organizationally? What about between, let's say, marketing and finance, or business unit A and business unit B within a larger corporation or a conglomerate of some kind? How do you see that playing out? Because you work with some very large organizations on a regular basis. You must have some perspective on this.
I do, Jeremy, and it's some of it is actually buried in the cybersecurity framework from NIST. There's a lot of controls and a lot of talk about risk management, but buried in there is a fundamental key to how organizations can mature their security. And it's when you start to understand risk, you have to understand your organizational risk. To do that, and this is why you have all those different profiles, is knowing that the business unit may own an application. The IT organization owns its deployment and management. Marketing or sales or the revenue generation part of the organization understands why that application is important. Or finance may understand what they're doing with that. It's bringing those pieces together actually is how you get an informed risk decision or risk management. So when you talk about marketing, well, why are they important? They're absolutely critical because they know what part of the sites are getting hit. They have the data, as far as where users go, which means that's important to your business. They know the campaigns that are coming and what are the dependencies they have as far as the business operations. Similarly with IT and finance, all of them have a piece of that story, which goes back to the point earlier. How do I prioritize and identify the critical assets? And oftentimes companies make the mistake of thinking, well, it's got to be my front door website or it's got to be my core business application. And this is where having the different business units involved in IT and finance and legal is understanding the dependencies. Because you could have the best customer portal, but if your registration service goes down, no one can get in. Or if the reporting system that's actually doing the financial accounting after the transaction is being attacked, you're not going to recognize revenue. And so understanding the core dependencies of that critical system is how you build a risk management view of the prioritization / criticality of a given set of systems. Going back again to your vulnerability assessment, then when I know, from, CVE for Log4j, perhaps in the future we'll have SBOMs for all our apps and we'll know which ones had Log4j. And then looking at the business operations side to understand the criticality of a given application to do that prioritization. Or, in some cases, where do I need to put my, my minimal amount of resources I have available to go tackle that problem? And so ultimately what a lot of that management and risk assessment does is it helps you better manage your team so they're not all firefighting things that aren't critical to the organization. It allows you to point your resources at the right place.
Okay. And, along those lines, there's a couple things that, kind of come to my mind as questions. And there's just a couple things I want to cherry pick out of what you said to dig in on a little bit. So number one is when you're thinking about putting things in their place or finding things out of place, one challenge that you see consistently across larger organizations is like, the way that team one talks about it is different from the way that team two talks about it. And that could be as simple as like, our Word documents look like this, your Word documents look like that. And I wonder, if we're not going to face similar problems when it comes to sharing cybersecurity data, because I use a SIM format that includes certain fields and you use a different format that doesn't include those fields, but includes a few other ones. How do we get away from that kind of challenge? And second is like along the lines of NIST and standards, there's something that I've been looking at and I'd be curious to get your take on, which is the OCSF, the Open Cybersecurity Schema Framework. Have you spent any time looking at it? And if so, what are your thoughts on it?
Okay, so I'll start with your first question, Jeremy, and I think there's two parts to that answer. One is organizationally, and one is from the products and technologies we're using. So starting on the organization, we see this all the time. People speak different languages. Legal speaks a different language from finance, speaks a different language from the development and engineering organization, and the cybersecurity are speaking Greek to everybody. And so part of the organizational challenge and opportunity is to provide that internal translation. Some of it is incumbent on security because ultimately they're the ones who touch most of those organizations to learn the language of the folks they're talking to. And the successful cybersecurity organizations and CISOs don't talk about SQL injection and buffer overflows. They talk about in terms that the CIO or the business unit can understand: downtime, input sanitization and validation for developers. They talk about access control. They talk about it in terms not only that are the technical terms more common and easy to understand, but also they put it into terms of the value. So when a business operations is looking at the uptime of their application, the stability of their application, or the number of users that they can
things like process. Fraud prevention.
Exactly. Putting it into those kind of business terms where they can understand what the impact of a security event is, or this particular problem in the business terms, in the compliance terms, as opposed to in the technical, here's what this buffer overflow did in this particular environment, here's what the ransomware gained. Moving away from that technical security speak to more business speak is actually where the CISOs are getting, now they're a standard part of the board conversation of the executive leadership because they're talking the language that everyone can understand. And so that is something that a lot of the forward-leaning CISOs are doing and security organizations. One mechanism that I've seen very successful is getting representatives from the different lines of business and organizations in a company involved with security early in the process. So they, number one, have input, but also the security people are listening to what are the requirements, what are the metrics that they're measured on, so that they can better align their activities to the overall business strategy. The other part of the question you asked at the beginning is how do we get our products talking to each other? And that is a significant problem. Even within a particular product category, you want to talk about EDR solutions or SIMs, they all have their custom formats. And I think this is something that both from companies and from vendors have to do a better job of interoperability, of creating standard ways of communicating of information flows and data. There's been multiple initiatives for the last 10, 15 years around developing common schemas and common frameworks, as well as the message buses to communicate information across different products and vendors in the same category. That's a good step one. We've seen, going back many years ago even, examples in the application security space of having a common XML schema for listing the application security vulnerability data. And we've seen that evolve into, AV and other areas. It gets even worse when we start talking cross domain, from a network security engine to a desktop security engine to an enterprise, keeping that trend of how do we interoperate the data. And this is an opportunity where industry collaboration and standards or guidance is really critical. The really successful ones have gone that step further, not just publishing, here's our document, everyone should subscribe to it, but actually then doing interop testing. And, NIST has done this. Many of the, OASIS and open group initiatives have not only put out, here's a standard schema that the key industry players are going to adhere to, but also doing interop testing where they take the product from the different vendors, they put them in a lab, and they test, does it actually work? And they give feedback both to the vendors and into the documents of what did and what needs to be fixed so that we can get better at that. Because ultimately, we're all in this together. No matter all the vendors and the organizations that are purchasing them are in this together to help stop the cyber threat actors. Yeah. And to do that, we need that collaboration. We need interoperability because it isn't just the firewall that's going to hit or the EDR or the cloud security service. All of them together have to work in concert for any organization, small or large, to get an idea of what's really going on and how do I stop this bad activity. The other thing, and this is a recommendation we're seeing the government take and others, is you got to put your money where your mouth is. When you buy products, you need to make it part of the requirements of your procurement, of your RFP, interoperability, APIs, standard schemas. Yep. Not everything's going to work together with everything else out of the box, but there has to be the potential. And so if the company isn't building APIs in to easily be able to retrieve and interact with that application and the data, if they're not using standard formats for their data, that's going to make it hard to integrate into and to scale inside an enterprise. And so making that a requirement is going to drive the industry and drive the vendors to make that a priority. And ultimately, that's sometimes what it takes. We're seeing that with the federal government putting out their requirement. They want SBOM. They want a softer bill of materials. And the only way they're going to get that is if they force through contract language to get that. And we're going to see that trend come to other regulated industries as well.
Yeah. Well, as somebody who built a company that does API security, you're certainly speaking our language, and we won't say anything negative around that in any way. But we do, to your point, we support that, and we also make sure that customers are aware that we don't expect you to live inside our product or platform. And in fact, I think if you're a cybersecurity vendor of any kind, you shouldn't expect a customer to be spending their days inside your product or platform, right? Most of the time, customers want to kind of set it and forget it. Put in place a rule set, put in place a set of policies, put in place a set of, detection algorithms that you're looking for. And the product should perform as such, and then, work with you in the place where you do your day-to-day work. For some people, that'll be email. For others, it'll be Teams, chat. It might be a ticketing system, what have you. It might be a SIM, et cetera. But I want to come back to something that we kind of touched on earlier in the conversation. There's something that I get a lot of confusion about when I talk to customers about NIST in particular. And as somebody who has spent some time working on NIST initiatives, and I think may still have an ongoing role at NIST or an ongoing involvement with NIST, yes?
Yeah, I'm still working on multiple security standards and guidance from NIST, yes.
Awesome. One of the questions I get from people is, okay, the NIST has all these publications of different types, right? You've got your classic 800.53. You've got your cybersecurity framework. There's one that we've looked at on the API side relative to microservices. I think it's 800.204 or something like that, but I might have that number wrong. Don't quote me. In any event, one of the challenges or one of the questions I get from people is how should they think about or understand those things? Because some of them, like 800.53, seem to be somewhat prescriptive guidelines for particular, let's say, technology stacks or industries or use cases or what have you, while others like cybersecurity framework are more like guiding principles, right? And they have these kind of like 5 pillars, and they've got these kind of, general categories of activities that you should be pursuing. How do you talk to customers about this if they ask you this question? Well, Steve, I don't know. Do I do 800.53? Do I do cybersecurity framework? And if I do cybersecurity framework, where's my checklist? What's the right way to think about this?
So I think you've hit on it. coming at it from an interesting perspective, and let's look at it from three perspectives. NIST really does three kinds of things. And I'll put cybersecurity framework off to the side, but it's really one of the kinds, but it's bigger than any one of them. So one thing they do is they do put out standards for the government. 853, the 800 series, special publication 800 series, are typically the standards by which you achieve compliance of various different use cases that are relevant for the government and the broader industry. 853 is probably the most famous. It was started as part of the Federal Information Security Management Act, and every government application has to get the checkbox that it's 853. And we've seen it adopted by just about every regulated industry and most global organizations as the baseline of controls. And like I said, it prescribes controls and a great spreadsheet of mapping of controls to cultural requirements, to control domains, to actual implementations. That's let's say the bread and butter of a lot of the.
So this is your classic, I need a checklist of controls that I need to be putting in place and verifying and gathering evidence, et cetera. That's this 800, SP 800 family of documents. Exactly.
Then the other set, the next set are what we call the guidance documents. And these aren't thou shalt, these are guidance on big issues. There's guidance that comes out on novel things that are still coming. So there are many technologies that are still evolving. And so they won't have a standard yet, but they'll give you best practices and guidance. A lot of these come out as IRs or interagency reports. Sometimes they come out as just standard documents. In the case of CSF, it was a bigger undertaking than just a single guidance. It's really about how do we evolve to a risk management approach at complex enterprises. So there's many guidance components and profiles underneath the CSF. And when you dig into CSF, there are implementation templates of how do you then start mapping your controls into those regimes. But at its core, that's a set of guidance. So like you said, it's not you will do this. It's here's some best practices about addressing, AI security or IoT for smart cities and things along those lines. In the last several years, the next thing that NIST has started doing is the practice guides, the 1800 series. And that's where they take an actual implementation. They say, okay, if you want to do trustworthy VMs using VMware on this cloud stack with this firewall, here is a practice guide. And what that practice guide says, if you're looking to implement these security controls in this kind of environment, here's what we were able to deploy in a lab, and here's the things to do to deploy it according to the requirements to meet those 853 or other control regimes. So it's actual implementation guides. And one of the really interesting things about it is they bring in a diverse community. So when you're talking about, they'll bring in Kubernetes and VMware and Zen. They'll bring in multiple firewall vendors, multiple GRC vendors, and they'll put them in the lab at the National Cybersecurity Center of Excellence up in Maryland and actually build that infrastructure, document everything that had to be done to deploy those products to meet those security requirements. And those practice guides, the 1800 series, are the practical side of, okay, I want to do these controls. I want to achieve these guidance. Here's how you do it. Here's one example. Now, will that work for every organization? No, but it gets you 80% of the way there to set up your infrastructure the correct way. And so what you're seeing from this is this three-pronged approach of control regime guidance documents on the overarching architectures and technology directions, and then practical implementation guides of here's how you secure these things. And NIST is one amazing resource. There are others. Believe it or not, the NSA puts out regular documents on best practices, how to secure your Linux, how to turn on secure boot, and they publish it in the open source. And so where the government has a mandate to help its citizens and help the world be more secure. And so a lot of these organizations are publishing both guidance as well as control documents and implementation guides.
That's awesome. And that is something I have to say, I did not know about this 1800 family of documents at all. I knew about the first two, the cybersecurity framework and the 800 series as well. How do you think about the correspondence between 800 and 1800? Is there like a corresponding 1853 that is the guidance for 853 in terms of getting up and running on it, or how's that designed?
So think of 1800 as very tactical implementation guides of specific things, secure containers, being able to build out, secure virtualization or be able to do identity management. So they've picked specific areas which map back to the 853 sort of on a much broader scale. So if you're going to deploy applications into a virtualized environment, There will be 1800 series practice guides for specific implementations.
Okay.
But there isn't like one 1800 for all of 853.
853.
I mean,
Okay.
853 is a big document. There's a lot that goes into there.
It's a beast. Yeah.
But for a lot of the ones, and really where the 1800 series comes from is from two places. Either government agencies have said, hey, I need help. What would be the best practice for this? Or industry has gotten together and said, we've got customers that want a common practice guide and work with NIST to develop it. And again, I can't iterate enough. It's one of the few places where you get competition working together in the same room. So you get multiple firewall vendors, multiple hardware vendors, multiple platform and cloud providers all collaborating to provide a practice guide or a set of guidance for the technologies they're deploying. And so one of the things that NIST really excels at is bringing together that community of practice to achieve those goals of interoperability, as well as guidance that a customer can then use to actually go solve their problems. Because ultimately, at the end of the day, you don't want to be a VMware security expert. You want to be an expert in your business. You want somebody else to have worked with VMware and with Kubernetes and with these other products to bridge that gap and bring the best of what's needed so you can go about your job, which is running a bank or selling your widgets online, whatever it is.
Well, I think that's such a great point, Steve, and it's really well said. And, kind of goes back to something that you said earlier, which is, the best and most effective security organizations, the most forward-leaning, are the ones that align to the business, where they talk about outcomes, not in terms of mitigation of any one particular risk, but in terms of how the security practices and the initiatives that they're bringing to bear are going to improve business outcomes for the entire organization. So that is such a great point. Steve Orrin, thank you so much for taking the time to join us on Modern Cyber. It's been a real pleasure talking to you. For our listeners, for our audience, where can they find you, follow your work, learn more about some of the initiatives that you're involved in?
So, Jeremy, there's two places to find me. Obviously on LinkedIn, which is SORRIN on LinkedIn. The other is to go to intel.com/public sector. And that's where we publish what we're doing in the federal space, as well as how we're using commercial technologies to solve federal problems.
Awesome. And we'll get those in the show notes as well as links to some of the stuff that we've talked about today, the NIST 800 family, the NIST 1800 family, the NIST Cybersecurity Framework. V2 came out a little while ago. I think we've actually covered that previously here on the shows. You should all be familiar with that. I'll also have a link to the OCSF that we kind of mentioned briefly in this. Steve Orrin, thank you so much for taking the time to join us here on Modern Cyber. To all our audience, if you're still with us and you've made it through this far of the episode, please do us a favor. Go ahead, hit that like, subscribe, follow, share, all that good stuff. Rate, review, you know what we're going to say here. And thanks for joining us, and we'll talk to you next time on the next episode of Modern Cyber.